So welcome to the 5 of you. I'm glad you could stay here for the last session of the day. I appreciate you making the time to do it. I'm Rob Heverly. I'm a professor at Albany Law School, and this conference is sort of right in my wheelhouse. I do everything related to technology and law. So I do a lot of stuff that centers around the internet, those things that center around any sort of technological push. I do a lot of drone work. I'm doing some stuff on legal issues and cyborgs, and all of those sorts of issues. So the kinds of stuff that comes up in ANYCon is really the kind of thing. Now, what I wanted to talk about today is why all of us, whether we're lawyers or not, should be thinking about and engaging with the law in all of the kinds of things we do and how we can't really check out, although it's really easy to want to check out. And so I'll just start by talking a little bit about the ways in which we think about each other. So the way that lawyers think about technologists and technologists think about lawyers. And a lot of time lawyers are thinking about technology in the way of, this thing doesn't do what I want. Please don't tell me to restart it. And they're maybe using Windows XP, maybe Windows 3.1. They don't have things locked down. Technology's not their thing. And so as an example, I had a law school professor back when I was at Albany Law School in '89. He didn't like the telephone. You know, the one with the landline. And he's still around, and I can't imagine what he's doing today. And so lawyers have these sorts of ideas about technology and about those kinds of things. And part of the way that we are thinking about all of that is sort of reflected in the way that you think back about us, which is reflected in some of these as well. It's along the lines of, I don't want to think about law. So lawyers don't want to think about technology. Technologists don't want to think about law. We get things like, I'm a programmer, not a lawyer. And so when you run into the technologists, they're either really mad about something that they may or may not understand, and the lawyers will be thinking about them and thinking about the way in which what they're doing challenges the law sort of in ignorance. And you've probably heard ignorance is no excuse, right? And so this is how lawyers many times are viewed and think about technology as well, right? I'm confounded by the magic voices coming from this enchanted talking box. And so what do we do about this? Why does this even matter? Well, because what lawyers do affects technology, and what technologists do affect lawyers. And when we talk past each other, and when we don't listen to each other, by the way, this says electrical work should only be performed by licensed electrician in full compliance with all local and federal construction codes if said electrician is additionally an attorney duly qualified and admitted to the practice in the jurisdiction of the bulb changing, then under normal circumstances, one lawyer can change a light bulb, right? So this is how we're seen. You come to us and you say, this is the coolest thing ever. And the lawyer goes, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. Stop doing that. That's not allowed. And that's how we're viewed back and forth. And this is lawyers too. We get in the middle of things, we don't know how they work, and then we're too afraid to ask. We don't want to say anything to anybody. But the difficulty is, with all of this, is that we can't just go into court and say it has technology and stuff. That can't be law's response, and it can't be technologists' response to close their eyes like the sea otter and sing la 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 and not listen to what's going on in law, because we need each other. We need to do things in the right way through understanding of each other. And so that's what this talk is about. It's about the ways in which hopefully lawyers and technologists can come to a little bit more understanding of each other. And I'm going to start with somebody who's pretty well known in the law field, Lawrence Lessig. He's going to tell us a little bit about what things regulate and set a little bit of a structure for some of the conversation.
Now, I begin by just setting up a framework of the things that typically are involved in regulation. What I call what things regulate, as a way to understand something more general than what lawyers typically understand when they think about the nature of regulation. So in the center of this picture is the pathetic red dot, this target of regulation, which will be the subject of the analysis which we present here. The target of this regulation, the red dot, is obviously, and as lawyers think, primarily regulated by the law. Probably the most important in many societies is the way that norms regulate behavior. The norms of a society will impose rules on individuals within that society about how they must behave or what their behavior with respect to other individuals must be. Those rules are governed not so much by strict absolute requirements, but often are governed by understandings of members within a community. This is the regulation of the market. The market sets conditions on which you're allowed to interact with others through property and contract. These conditions set, for example, prices that establish the relationship between the amount of one good that you get in exchange for another. Finally, and most importantly, in thinking about the way cyberspace will be regulated, is the regulation of what I'm calling architecture. Now, by architecture, I mean the way in which we find the world, or the physical space within which we find ourselves, even if the way we find the world has been constructed by individuals, not just by nature. These constructions impose constraints on our freedom, and those constraints are, in many senses, a kind of regulation. As the architecture of the internet changes, or what I call the code of cyberspace changes, then those changes can change the consequences that I described that the internet has. So, for example, as governments or the laws and the market or commerce change the relative anonymity of cyberspace through technologies such as this technology here, cookies, we will see changes in the consequence of what markets and governments can do. So, for example, the original architecture of the internet made it so that when you went with a browser to a website, that was a stateless transaction, meaning that the web server had no automatic way to know who you were, and therefore no way automatically to know that you were the person who was there 5 minutes ago, or you were the person who was looking at a different book on a different page of the website. This stateless architecture, of course, protected relative anonymity, but the problem was that it made it hard for the technology to enable the web server to track the desire of customers to, for example, consume or purchase items. And so, to respond to this particular problem, what the designers of early net architecture did was to develop a technology which we have called cookies, to enable the website to track what people are doing within the context of the website. But the important point to recognize is that that small change in the design of the network had a very important consequence to the relative anonymity of people behaving in the network, because it made it much easier for computers on the network to begin to monitor behavior of people on the network, because we now had a relatively automatic way to identify people and to track what they do, at least within the context of a particular website.
So that's a start off into the discussion of the fact that it's not just law that regulates. Lots of things regulate. And I like Lessig's use of them all around a dot because they're all pushing and pulling. And in different circumstances, law is primary, or the technology in terms of the architecture is primary. Who gets to decide when it comes to law what it is that you can and can't do? Well, in our system, we have a two-part system. We live in a federal republic, which means we have a federal government that can do some things, and then everything that the federal government isn't entitled to do under the Constitution is left to the states. And then there's a little overlap area where there might be some shared authority based on some peculiarities in the way that the Constitution is written and dealing with issues of commerce and those kinds of things. Really, though, what we've seen throughout my lifetime, and really throughout this and the latter part of the last century, was an expansion in the federal government's role. And that has a lot of implications for my topic here, because part of what it tells us is we need to interact at this sort of macro level where you feel like an even smaller fish in an even bigger pond. So it's hard enough to affect your local town and their policy making. It's harder still to go to your county and then to the state. But if you really have to try to do something at the national level, a lot of people just give up and they cover their ears and sing a song and they don't want to hear it anymore. So Part of what we need to recognize, though, is that we do have these multitude of levels of regulation controlling us on the legal side. And understanding them helps us come to grips with how we might want to interact with them. So how is the U.S. government set up? We've got a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. They're each co-equal. They each have their realms in which they do things. We like to say Congress makes the law, the executive enforces the law, and the courts interpret the law. That's way too simplistic, but we can sort of go with it here. What we're going to see is there are opportunities for us as technologists to be involved in all three parts. There's not a part of this that we need to stay out of for one reason or another. And it helps to work with the lawyers when you're working on these things. Now, if we take this kind of system, we've got the federal system. It's reflected there pretty much in the same type of picture. We've got the legislative branch and the executive branch and the judiciary there. That's mirrored at the state level. So for New York State, we've got the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Of course, we don't have a president in New York. We have a governor. I won't make any comments about that. We don't have a king, obviously. We've got the state agencies under the executive, and they actually kind of act like little mini governments. They make rules, they enforce laws, they interpret their rules that they've made. And that's a system that very much is like the federal, but of course it has its own separate authority. They're not somehow related in terms of where the authority comes from. New York City is a good example of a large local government, but you could have a small local government that might have some of these same kinds of authority. So now we've gone through a couple of different things, right? We're subject to federal control, we're subject to state control, we're subject to local controls. All of these are things that technologists might want to think about. But a different way to think about it is to think about the areas of law in which technology comes or it comes into contact with. Some are just general. They're just the same laws that everybody else deals with. Others are technology-specific laws. You might have a law that's specifically written to deal with a particular piece of technology. And others are what I refer to as domain-specific laws. So for finance or for health care, you might have specific laws. We don't care what technology you're using. Whatever technology you're using, if it relates to health, here are the rules. And so we'll see those at the federal level and the state and local level. We'll also see them at the organizational level. So you might have some general rules or some technology-specific rules because of an organization you belong to, whether it's a corporation or a nonprofit that's overseeing or accrediting a particular organization. And then some of these things can be imposed simply by agreement through grants and contracts. And so you might have obligations that arise in relation to using specific technologies because of a particular contract that you deal with. If we're going to just give some examples of general legal obligations, contract law is one. You agree to stuff. Generally, you have to do what you agree to. There are some circumstances in which we'll say you don't, but generally you do. Tort law is another one, negligence law. And so if you're careless in how you deal with your technology, you might be liable to those injured. Criminal law is another area that just applies to everybody regardless of whether you're using technology or not. And then consumer protection law, many times will come up as well. Again, this isn't an exclusive list, it's just a few. What other ones do we have technology specific? Well, the big topic these days is breach notification laws. If your organization is breached and you need to tell people that have had their information taken or stolen, that can be at the state level and the federal level. Destruction of data, depending on the realm that you're in, might be an area that's there as well. The NIST cybersecurity framework, which actually isn't really regulatory, but is sort of guidelines of a way, not really rules, they're more like guidelines. What about specific domain-specific laws, HIPAA? Anybody who does anything related to healthcare knows about the HIPAA rules. If you've ever gone into a doctor's office and they've made you sign that form that says they gave you their HIPAA rules when they haven't given you their HIPAA rules, but you just sign it because nobody wants to read the HIPAA rules and you have to sign it to get treated for whatever is ailing you. Another one is the New York State Department of Financial Services regulations that they have now in relation to cybersecurity. There's the payment card industry data security standard. So again, not coming from a government, but coming from an organization that does those things. The Food and Drug Administration has rules for maintaining technology that's implanted in bodies. So if you have some cyborg tech in you, there are rules about its maintenance. And then there are standards for electricity enterprises. So now what we've done is we've laid out a big framework, all of these things, and it can seem very overwhelming. A lot of technologists, again, just are like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I don't care about this. I'm going to go on doing what it is that I want to do. But hopefully we're getting you into where you can see it is, you can deal with it. It's all right. And it's important that we look at it that way and we sort of bring it in. So how are laws made? There we go. That's how laws are made. Every time I look at that, I'm like, what the heck is that? And then I go always back to this.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city.
So if you don't know what that is, it's I'm a Bill from Schoolhouse Rock. You can Google it. Disney has it available for free. The idea is that there is a simpler way to look at how a bill becomes a law. But what we're really concerned about is why legislators make the law. So what kinds of things are they thinking about when they're making law? Who is influencing them? Now, if you believe the popular narrative these days, it's all whoever has the money, right? That's who influences them, and that would pretty much leave us down here with just the lobbyists. Those are the other ones. But we have pressure groups. We have the administration. We have constituents. And believe it or not, legislators, even at the national level, respond to constituents, depending on the action that they take. Political party plays a role. Personal beliefs, re-election concerns, colleagues and staff, all of these things influence legislators and are the kinds of things that we can become involved in and say, hey, I'm gonna try to get some influence here and do something in relation to what the law is and where it's going. So, one area that we can actively become involved in, law and legislation. Another one is the rulemaking process, regulations. Agencies within the executive branch make regulations. That's what they do. And then they go out and they enforce those regulations. Many times they do interpretations of them and enforcement within that realm as well. Again, this looks pretty complicated, but as we come to the end, there are some definite ways that you can be involved in the regulatory process. And part of what I'm going to be arguing for you to do is to educate people as to how the technology works and what it's used for, and arguing for uses that are sort of in the best interests of society. Another of the areas is lawsuits. And that seems sort of closed. That seems like a really closed box. Somebody files a suit, there's a trial, there's a jury verdict, maybe there's an appeal. You've heard about appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court or the courts of appeals. We've got those systems within the U.S. federal courts, so the Supreme Court and the federal courts of appeal and the district courts are all there. The systems are mirrored at the state level, and so this is the New York civil state structure. Most states have a high court of their own. They generally call it the Supreme Court. New York doesn't do that. Our highest court is the Court of Appeal. That leads to lots of fun confusion when people don't know that. Our appellate courts are called the Appellate Division. We have one that sits right over there, or I guess it's kind of behind me at this point where I am, called the Appellate Division, 3rd Department. This is just another example. That's Florida's. They do have a Supreme Court. They decided to sort of follow the normal rules for everybody else. And if you look at what a lawsuit looks like, again, it doesn't look like there's a lot of ways for us to jump in there and influence that. And so it's a really good opportunity for us to just wander away and not pay any attention to what's going on. And it's exactly the opposite of what I want to have happen. Now, in all of this as well, the thing that technologists that I've worked with the most have expressed to me is they want an answer. Please, lawyer, give me an answer to life, the universe, and everything. And that's generally what somebody, when they come to a lawyer, wants. They want advice and an answer to a particular question. And so they'll say, sort of, keep calm and tell me an answer. And my response is no. Many times I can't give you clear answers. It's the nature of law. And so legal analysis is very much case by case, and there's a lot of uncertainty in it. There's a lot more uncertainty than people would lead you to believe. So as when I go and talk to lawyers about talking to technologists, and lawyers get frustrated with the terminology and all the acronyms and the shared understandings that aren't actually there when they're having the conversation, technologists get mad that lawyers won't give answers. But that's what legal answers are, especially to hypotheticals. I don't like hypotheticals. Give me a real situation where you can't nudge a fact one way or the other. That's what I do as a law professor. That's how I train the law students, by changing one fact and then suddenly their entire answer changes. So we don't like those. So why does all of this matter? Why should we care about any of this when we're thinking about whether I'm trying to get you to do something that maybe you don't really want to do. You want to go and do the stuff that you want to do. Why should I try to drag you into the public sphere and dealing with law? Well, because if not, then this happens.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Daily Show. My name is Don Stewart. Coming up on today's program, oh, we got a fine show for you tonight. Yes, oh, I am delighted to. Thank you, right down here. Today's show is a good one. Shawn Wayans. Shawn Wayans will be joining us. We're very excited about that. But I want to talk to you about this exciting thing I've discovered. I want to talk to you tonight about the internet. I'm going out on a limb here. I'm going to stand up and be one of the first guys to say it. I think this is a keeper. I think this thing is here to say, right now, two key internet-related issues are making the rounds in Washington, D.C. One involves the Net Neutrality Act, which would allow larger, more powerful corporations higher speed access to customers, establishing a two-tiered hierarchy amongst... you know what? It's awfully complicated. Why don't I let an expert, say the head of the Senate Commerce Committee, which regulates e-commerce, explain?
The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.
All right, that might have sounded more like something you'd hear from, let's say, a crazy old man in an airport bar at 3 a.m. Then the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, I'm sorry, sir, I don't quite think I understand your dump truck tube symposium. Do you have something a little more practical for me?
And if you don't understand, those tubes can be filled, and if they're filled, when you put your message in, it gets in line, it's going to be delayed by anyone that puts into that tube enormous amounts of material, enormous amounts of material.
Well, there you have it, folks. There's apparently an enormous amount of material clogging Ted Stevens' tubes. Now, perhaps a little fiber optic cable might be the answer. Stevens ended his lecture by offering a concrete example of the problem we face.
10 movies streaming across that internet, and what happens to your own personal internet? I just the other day got internet was sent by my staff at 10 o'clock in the morning on Friday. I got it yesterday. Why?
I'll tell you why. 'Cause the creek run dry is what happened. And there's Comanches in the past and the women in the internet. Actually, why didn't Senator Stevens get it until yesterday? Well, this is just a little bit of a guess here, but maybe it's because you don't seem to know jack about computers or the internet.
And that's what we want to stop. We want to stop legislators who are in charge of committees that regulate the technology from regulating from a position of ignorance. And the only way we can do that is if we engage with them, if we do the things that I'm asking you to do. And so, what is it that you do? Well, some things that have been done included stopping SOPA and PIPA, two horrible, horrible laws. I'm sort of overstating there, but they would have done some real damage to the way in which the internet functions. The internet would be different. It would still be here, but it would have been different if those laws had passed. And part of that was a blackout on the internet, which got a lot of people engaged in what the issues were because their websites that were their favorite websites went black and they couldn't use them. And then they understood what was happening. And then they reached out to Congress members and senators in relation to those laws, and those laws did stop. What else can you do? You can educate the public and take direct action. So this is Aaron Swartz. He committed suicide after being indicted in Boston for trying to download information that was out of copyright, but in downloading it ostensibly violated the terms of the website that he was downloading it from because his purpose was to make it available for free on another site. And so he took direct action and took a lot of direct action in relation to the things that he believed in technology-wise. And so this is part of his reason why.
I mean, I feel very strongly that it's not enough to just live in the world as it is, to just kind of take what you're given and, follow the things that adults told you to do and that, your parents told you to do and that society tells you to do. I think you should always be questioning. I take this very scientific attitude that everything you've learned is just provisional, that, it's always open to recantation or refutation or questioning. And I think the same applies to society. Once I realized that there were real serious problems, fundamental problems that I could do something to address, I didn't see a way to forget that. I didn't see a way not to.
You could also become a lawyer. We need more people who have the technology background to go into law. You have the mindset, I'll tell you. It's the same kind of analysis that you do in designing technology, whether it's code or hardware, and would apply really well. And you would bring a wealth of knowledge for a lot of people who don't want to understand the technology. Remember what I said, if I was talking to lawyers, it's just the flip-flop side of this discussion. They need to engage the technology. It helps now that the disciplinary authorities have told them that they're supposed to understand the technology or else they're committing malpractice. That's a useful clutch that we can use with lawyers. But they're just going to hire somebody, some of them, and they won't understand it. But they could still end up in cases with it. They could still end up doing regulations and law and designing rules and writing contracts. You guys can go and learn about law. You could become lawyers and go into the field and educate. What else can you do? Well, I showed the legislative map, a little bit of the Schoolhouse Rock bill. There are lots of places in there to intervene. Go into your legislators. Find out who they are. There's a hierarchy of what works. Office visits are best. Phone calls are next. A personal email is supposedly then next, and then all they do is count the form letters. They can filter off the form letters and they count them, and sometimes they care about them, sometimes they don't. Depends on the legislator. But if you go into an office and you talk to a staff member about an issue that concerns you, that supposedly, according to people in the offices, makes a difference. We've seen some of that in some of the run-ups since the changeover in January, that there's been a lot of movement from people on different things. And when technology comes up, you should go and see them. And you should talk to them about what the technology means. Don't talk to them about how the technology works. Tell them what it can do for them and for their constituents. That's what they're going to be worried about. What about regulations? That seems all very sort of formal and formalistic. They publish things, they publish rules. You can comment. Any regulation that's going to be adopted has to be published first for a comment period. And anybody can submit a comment. Write a comment. Get other people in to write comments. Make them pointed. Make them related and relevant to what the agency is trying to do. What else can you do? What about cases? You can't be involved in a case unless you get sued or sue somebody, right? Well, that's wrong. Especially if it's on appeal. Because all courts have a process called the amicus process. And an amicus is known, that's a word for friend of the court. And you're not a party to the lawsuit, but you have an angle or some information that you can provide to the court that will help them decide the case. Maybe something that's not represented by the parties. It's not useful to simply go and parrot what the parties are saying. But if everybody's talking about a new technology or something that you know something about and they're getting it wrong, then you should do an amicus brief. How do you do that? You find a lawyer like me willing to write the brief for free as a pro bono effort. You're the amicus. You work with the lawyer to write the brief to make sure it's represented. If you want to see some of those, go to the U.S. Supreme Court site. The amicus briefs are on there. You see them. The U.S. Supreme Court gets tons of them. But where you can really make a difference is the New York Court of Appeals and the appellate divisions. Even the circuit courts in the federal system don't get as many amicus briefs. And when they're done by technologists who know what they're doing, they can influence the decision and help it at least turn, maybe not in the direction you want, but for reasons that are understood by the court. So that the court's not writing about the internet as a series of tubes, because that's not what we really want to have happen. And so you could do a lot of the protest kind of stuff too. You can do the next one that's coming up is this July 12th Internet Stand to Save Net Neutrality. The FCC, toward the end of the Obama administration, implemented rules that ensured net neutrality from internet service providers. One of the dissenters from that opinion at the FCC is now the chair, and they have the votes to rescind those rules, and they're in that process. And so this is a protest that's going online on July 12th. You can join that process. But part of what I'm asking you to do, or really the heart of what I'm asking you to do, is to help the lawyers and the policymakers connect the dots. Now, if you're completely cynical, you're not going to want to do this because you don't think it matters. But I can tell you that even in today's environment, it does matter. Even if it's giving weapons to the people who are already on your side and helping them better understand the technology to make better and stronger arguments against colleagues who might not be focused on the things that we wish that they were focused on. Draw the lines for them. Connect those dots. Put it together in a way that it makes sense. And unfortunately, as what we're seeing now, you've got to do that over and over again. Because when you think you've won a battle, like net neutrality at the FCC, it can be undone. And if it's undone, or if somebody threatens to undo it, then we've got to get in there, and we've got to do it again. And we've got to fight the battle, and that's July 12th, the start or another step in the battle against the undoing of net neutrality. And so I hope that those of you who are here will think about ways that you can interact in this space and put some time to it and reach out to lawyers who are similarly minded and work together to improve the whole process for everybody. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to talk to you about any of these things. Yeah?
I was curious about your involvement with advocacy groups that you participate in any of them that are technologically related, and if so, go forth and doing that on your own, or approach
So I don't know if I'll be able to think of examples. The internet or law and technology law professors from throughout the country are pretty well connected through both in-person meetings and a fairly good set of listservs. And so I've signed on to a lot of briefs written by experts in a variety of fields in a number of cases. The one brief that I've done to the Supreme Court was in a whistleblower case, and I was approached to do that one. I was approached to do another one in a journalism case that I won't be able to do because the time frame's too short. And it goes both ways. I've looked for people to be amicus, and then I've been approached. And then I've joined other briefs being written by other people. Right. And after commenting, because we're all lawyers, so, and further, we're all law professors. So you can imagine sending your brief out and saying, okay, who wants to sign on, and then getting back, the comments that would come. But there's usually a pretty good and robust discussion, and then we sign on to the briefs, sometimes en masse. Right?
I'm curious about organizations like EFF or CDT or specific legal organizations. What are some of the groups that are that are pushing on the issues?
Well, probably one of the strongest right now is the ACLU, which has really come out strongly. EPIC, which is about privacy. CDT, Center for Democratic Technology, is leading efforts. There's been a group of people that have come together and brought in industry in D.C. and have been trying to reform the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is way, way, way too old and is a mess at the federal level. It's one of those technology-specific things that was really written for wireline phones with a couple of little nudges here and there, and it's a real mess, but we can't seem to get any movement on it. I follow that effort. I haven't actively participated in it, but EPIC's in there, EFF is in there. And then there are the centers. Stanford has a center on internet. You're affiliated with that one, right? So what's the name? Okay, so the Center for Internet Society. Harvard has the Berkman Center. Yale has the Information Society Project. There are other places that you can reach out to find people who are similarly minded. I mean, part of the difficulty with some of the larger groups is it's hard, for example, in EFF to get in and actually do volunteer work. ACLU, same thing. Even as an attorney, I don't get a lot of chances through them to do, say, amicus briefs or representation of parties, because they're large. And so they have lots of people who that's what they'd love to do. And so if you wanted to do that, getting involved in the similar kinds of organizations or staking out a place in state legislation or state policy could be really useful. There was another hand before? No? Okay. Well, great. Well, thanks for staying until the very end with, like I said, no food or drinks promised after. So I hope you'll all have a great time and enjoy the program again tomorrow.